Good morning, everybody. As we go to the Chitas of today, we are holding in the portion of the Yisrei. We are in the Friday, it's sixth portion of this week's Parsha, the highlight actually of the Parsha, the Aseres Adibres, which is in the sixth reading of Parshat Yitro. We are holding on chapter 19, verse number 20. Vayered Havai El Har Sinai, and God came down the mountain. Aray Shahar, and at the top of the mountain, the peak of the mountain, Vayikra Hashem Moshe, and God called Moshe. Aray Shahar, God called Moshe to the top of the mountain. Vayal Moshe, and Moshe went up to the mountain. Now it says Vayered Hashem. Is it possible that he actually descended upon it? What is the meaning? The Abish is all over the world. Scripture therefore states that I spoke with you from the heavens. However, the intent here is to teach us that God lowered the upper and lower heavens and spread them out above the mountain like a blanket over a bed. And the throne of God descended upon it. Now, this is an interesting Rashi, and there's many what Rashi Chassidus is self-understood, much more understood what's the meaning of the connection of the upper worlds and the lower worlds, and how God brought down the upper worlds, spirituality, into the lower worlds, and that is Matan Torah, really, the concept of the unity of the upper worlds and the lower worlds. And God said to Moshe, go down and warn the people, they might break their ranks. They're going to have such a desire to go above that they are going to come up the mountain. And many people, God forbid, will die. Now she says, go out and warn them not to go up the mountain. Penya Horsi, do not break their position, because they will all have a desire to see God and move closer to the mountain, because it's going to create a koloyas hanefesh, so to say. It will create the concept of the yearning of spirituality. But Nafal Mimenu Rav, Rashi says, Kol Masha that whatever chas v'shalom by God, even if one Jew falls, that's a lot. If God forbid one Jew dies, to me it's a lot. Pen Yaharsu. Now she said every destruction entails the separation of an assembled structure. Similarly, those who break apart from a position of a group of a people thereby destroys that position. Pen Yaharsu. Verse 22, V'gam ha'kehanim ha'negoshon l'havaya, and also the priests, that come close to God, yiskatshu, they make sure that they become holy. Pen yifritz bem Hashem, because if they also do a breach, even the kehanim which came closer need to be careful not to come too close. Who are the kehanim at that time? As she says, even the firstborn. At that time, the firstborn were chosen within the nation. And they had this. They had a distinction of being chosen to divine service during this period before Aaron, before the story of the Egel, which then the firstborns were demoted and Aaron was elevated. And the Gosham Alavayad, to serve sacrifices, they too should not rely on the position of importance. So the firstborn should not think, since the firstborn, they can come closer than they are allowed. Yishkot yourself that they should prepare themselves, that they should remain where they are. And Yifrites, again, Yifrites is Lashon Pizza. It's a concept of a breach. Thus God kills some of them and causing a breach amongst them. And God said, and Moshe said to God, they can't come up anymore, because you already warned us. You should make a boundary, and sanctified us. Tanash says, I do not need to warn them, for they have already been warned, and remained as now, and remain so now for 3 days already. So they cannot ascend the mountain, for they are not permitted to do so. They have boundaries. We have put up boundaries, signs, etc. So we already accomplished that. But God says to him, no late, go down still and go down to the people. Go down, and you must ascend Aaron with you, and the priest and the people must not break their ranks to ascend to God. Because there will be a chas v'shalom, be a breach. Rashi says, go down and warn them a second time. But typically, one instruction instructs a person in advance of an action and does so again when the time of the action arrives. Valisa Aaron, come up with Aaron. Therefore states Valisa, then you must ascend Aaron with you and the priests. For these words I might have thought that also the priests will, the Kehanim, the firstborns, will ascend with you. Therefore the Torah says, Valisa Ata, you must ascend. But here we refer that the intent is you will have your own station, Aaron will have his own station, and the priests will have their own station. Moshe approached further than Aaron, Aaron approached further than the priest, and the people must not break the position to send it to God. Verse 25, Vayela Moshe Alam, and Moshe Rabbeinu went down to the people, Vayema Aleim, and he instructed them. Now she says, Isra'zu, he warned them again this warning. Chapter 20, verse number 1. Then God spoke these words, Lamer, saying. Now she says that Elikim is always refers to God as a judge, Elikim. Similarly, it says you must not curse Elikim, Elikim loisekalal. Uncle is translated Elikim Dayana, a judge, because there are passages in the Torah containing precepts in which a person perceives reward through fulfilling them, but incurs no punishment for not fulfilling them. I might have thought that the Ten Commandments are also so. That's like it's a inspirational statement. Therefore, the Torah says by a dabalakim, indicating that this is not a if chance situation. This is an obligation. You have to obligate yourself to these things. It's called Dvarim Me'ela, all these words. This teaches us that the Holy One, blessed be He, said all 10 commandments in one utterance. If so, what's the meaning of Scripture? I am God, your God. You must not possess any other deities. It's telling us that God repeated it, and He articulated each commandment separately. Question is, why did God do that? He said in the one commandment, why do you have to articulate it? And if you articulate it, what did He say in the one commandment? The answer is that all commandments are one concept. They're one concept, even though each commandment has its separate mitzvah, but it's all one concept. It's I am God, your God. Concept of God, as we learn in Chassidus. Lamer, one means saying, because lamer means to tell somebody, to say. Every Jew was at Mount Sinai. So what means lamer? Lamer does not make sense over here. Usually it says, and God spoke to Moshe lamer, to say to the Jewish people. What does the word lamer over here mean? So this teaches us that the Jewish people responded, lamer. God wanted a response when he was asked. When there was a positive commandment, God wanted a response, yes. And when there was a negative commandment, God wanted a response, no. Lamer, for them to say something. So that's the meaning. That's one of the meanings, one of the interpretations of the word lamer. So the Israel respond yes for the positive and no to the negative. Verse number 2, God, your God, who is taking you out of the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. Rashi says, this phrase means, as taking you out of Egypt, it's sufficient for this reason, that you be servants subject to me. And another explanation, because God appeared at the Sea of Reeds as a mighty warrior. And here he appeared at a venerable old man, so to say, filled with compassion. As it says, they had a vision of God of Israel, and beneath his feet was a likeness of the brick of sapphire. This was before him during the period of Israel's servitude, and in appearance like the clearness of the heavens after they were redeemed. So you might think, God forbid, there's two deities. So therefore he says, since I manifest many very likeness, do not think there are two deities, God forbid. But I am the same one who brought you out of Egypt. I'm the same one who took you to the sea. Another explanation, because you were hearing many voices, as it says, the voice of God, voices plural, because the sounds were coming from all four directions, and from the heaven and the earth, God therefore said to them, don't think there are many deities. And why did God use a singular verse form, Elekecha, your God, to give Moshe an opportunity to plead for the defense of Israel at the incidents which would happen 40 days later at the golden calf? And this is indeed what Moshe Rabbeinu said, God, why should you display an indignation against your people? For it could have been said that not to them was the commandment. You spoke to me. You must not possess any other deities, but to me alone. So Elekecha is a singular. In essence, Moshe Rabbeinu became the lawyer for the Jewish nation, and he told God that the truth is, you said it in that kind of a way that it was to me and not to anybody else. Beis Avodim, you were taken out of the house of slavery, means out of the house of Pharaoh, where you were slaves to him, or perhaps out of the house of slaves. So why does it say it's Beis Avodim? We say that Mitzrayim is enough. Why does it add from the house of slaves? So therefore, the Torah wants to tell us, the Torah states, and he redeemed you from the house of slaves, from the hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, which then further you were slaves to a king. So God said, listen, you were ultimately totally under the Pharaoh's hand. So that means you were the slave of a king. So ultimately, and no slaves to slaves. So ultimately the Jews were the slaves of the king of Pharaoh. So therefore, it was not that you were slaves of slaves. I do not possess any idols of other people, deities, as long as I exist. You're not allowed to possess. Why is it said? Answer is, since it says you must not make yourself. I can only derive that one must not make an idol. From where do I know that one must not retain an idol? How do you know you're not allowed to buy an idol? It says that is already made. Scripture, therefore, the Torah says you're not allowed to possess gods of others. It's a very interesting expression, which are not really gods, but others made them into gods over themselves. That's the meaning of Elokim Achedim. God forbid to say there's other gods, and God has to tell you not to have another God. Elokim Achedim, Rashi translates, there are many interpretations to this word, Elokim Achedim. You have the Chassidus Tanya. Elokim Achedim over here, Rashi says, means that others make him as a God. But these words cannot properly explain as meaning as other gods besides me, because it's an insult to one above to call them gods along with him. So therefore, we have to understand what means other gods, and a simple interpretation means that other make him a god. Another explanation, L'kim achedim, they are strangers, achedim, to those who worship them, for they call upon them and they don't answer. And that's what's that, and it's as if the idol is a stranger to the worshiper that has never known him, because it's not even a god that's screaming out to the wood and to the eleitzim valavonim, as it says. It says, they might have a mouth, they don't speak. They have eyes, they don't see. They have ears, that don't hear. Alponai, upon my face, means as long as I exist. These words are added so that that you don't think that the commandments against idolatry only applies to that generation standing up Mount Sinai. So therefore, this avera of idolatry is a sin forever. You're not allowed to make yourself a sculpture. Any other likeness of the heaven. Mimal, V'asher ma'oretz mitachas, and from the heavens and from the earth below. V'asher b'mayim mitachas la'oretz, and the water that is below the earth. Pesel is a sculpture. It's called because it's carved out. V'chol tmuna, or any image, anything that's in heaven. You're not allowed to bow down to them. Of them. So you're not allowed to make it even as an idol. And then you're not allowed to bow down to them. It's two different Avedas. Of them, you're not allowed to bow to them. You're not allowed to serve them. I am God, your God. Kel Kana. I am a zealous God. Peked oven aves albanim. I take the revenge of the sins of the father on the children. Al Shlishim, on the descendants of three Valibeim, on 3 to 4 generations, to those L'Sainai, to those that hate me. Rashi says, when it comes to the sin of idolatry, he is zealous to act exact punishment and does not pass over his principles and forgives the sins of idolatry. Every instance, the word kane in Old French is zealous, anger, meaning he sets his heart, one of the cardinal sins, murder, idolatry, and adultery. L'soinai, those who hate me. This explains that the Unklish translates it as Kad Mishalmin Benayel Lemechte Basar Avusain. This is subsequent generation persists when the father's evil practice. It means when a child continues to practice the father's sinful ways of life. So when God forbid, a son continues idolatry because his father was an idol worship, then God says, the sins will continue upon one generation to the next generation. So, but God preserves kindness of a person does not by providing reward for up to 2,000 generations. So over here, when it says reward, we see the difference. Actually, the Rashi in essence says that we see the pasuk comes to tell us how great reward is over punishment. Over here it says 3 generations. When it says about kindness, it says, as the next verse, God provides kindness up to 2,000 generations. Thus it follows that God's attribute of goodness is 500 times greater than his attribute of retribution. But it preserves the detriment up to 4 generations, and the merit up to 2,000 generations. So therefore we see that chesed, how far chesed goes, that an act of kindness will go for thousands of generations. And God does kindness to 2,000 generations, to those who love him, and to those who observe his commandments. Now she says, and he stores up the mercy which a person does to give a reward for it to thousands of generations that are that person's descendants. It follows, therefore, that the measure of good reward is greater than the measure of punishment in the proportion of 500. For the former threatened only for 4 generations, while the latter bestowed upon thousands. We see verse number 7, 3rd prohibition. Do not swear by my name and God, your God, in vain. Because God will not absolve one who swears in his name in vain. Now she says, for nothing, worthless. Shav is nothing. And what is a vain oath? One who swears contradicting an obvious fact. For example, that the stone pillar is made out of gold. That is a vow in vain. It's not a vow that is a lie. It's a simple shav. It has no value. It's a valueless vow. So a person would make a vow that it's right now night outside in Boca. That's a vow in vain. It is worthless vow. It has no value. There are different laws and vows. There's a vow that's a lie. There's a vow that has no value. Remember the day of Shabbos to make it holy. Now she says, generally you should know there are 2 times that are written the 10 Commandments, one in this week's Parsha and one in the portion of Eschanon later on. Over here it says Zachar Shem HaShabbos. In the next, when it's written again, it says Shomer. So the word Zachar, which is the command, begins here and Shomer, in which it begins in the book of Deuteronomy, Eschanon. Over there it says Shomer. So Shomer v'Zachar, the Gemara says b'dibar echad. That Shomer and Zachar were both said in one utterance. And similarly, these two, those who desecrated must be put to death. And one Shabbos day, you offer 2 lambs. Similarly, you must not wear a mixture of wool and linen, and you must make yourself a twisted threads. And similarly, you must uncover the nakedness of your brother wife, and her husband's brother must marry this. That is, that it's meant when it says, 1 thing I did God speak, but 2 did I hear. So we have this expression that there sometimes are written 2 different ways in the Torah, and nevertheless, it's one concept. This is a Zachar of the Lashon Peil, similar Achol v'Shasa, eating and drinking, Hachol Aboy, walking and weeping. And this is the meaning. Zachar, pay attention constantly, remember the Shabbos, that it comes to you across the fine item of food during the week, designated for Shabbos. That's Zachar. Remember the Shabbos every single day. That's one of the Sheish Zechiros, one of the 6 remembrance we say every day. And that is to remember the Shabbos every day. Sheish Yisham and Tav is 6 days a week. You shall work. Vasisa kol malachtecha, you shall labor. Vasisa kol malachtecha, and you'll do all your work. What does that mean? And you'll do all your work. That means when the Shabbos arrives, you should regard as all your work as if it's completed, it's done. So you're not occupied with the thoughts of work on Shabbos. And on the 7th day, it's a Shabbos to God. Don't do any work. You, your daughter, son, your daughter, your servant, your maidservant, even your animal. And the alien that's permitted to live in your gates. Now she says, this son and daughter mentioned here are minors because everybody has their own obligation. But when it comes to Shabbos, we have to make sure our children also, that our children should keep the Shabbos. Or perhaps it meant adult children. This cannot be. You must say they're already included in the prohibition. That every adult has to keep the Shabbos like anybody else. But the Torah comes here only to instruct adults that they have their minor children, that they shouldn't say, oh, they're younger children, they're under bar mitzvah, so they can do avodah. They're not obligated. You're obligated to teach your children and make sure that they refrain from work on Shabbos. And so we have learned a minor who attempts to extinguish a fire, we don't listen to him and we don't allow him because the responsibility for refraining from work is incumbent upon a friend, that he should refrain from work is incumbent upon you. And therefore, you should teach your children to keep the Shabbos as if you are obligated to keep the Shabbos. The Eibishter made the heavens and the earth for 6 days. So Yom Veskol Shabam, the waters and everything that's in it. Vayanav Bayem Ashvi, and God rested on the 7th day. Al Kain Berachas Hashem Esayim HaShabbos Ve'Katsheu. And therefore God blessed the Shabbos and He sanctified it. Vayanav Bayem Ashvi. Now she says Kaviyachol. God, so to say, said about Himself something, that He rested on Shabbos. What does that mean? Dictated the rest as ascribed to Him, as if it were possible. God worked and God rested. So that we infer that from this, that the it's a easy to a hard argument that man who works is done with toil and effort should certainly rest on Shabbos. God, who doesn't toil, rested on Shabbos. So surely a man who does toil, and it's a hard week, should surely rest on Shabbos. This is one of the kal v'chomer. If God rested, we surely should rest. But God blessed it and sanctified it. Meaning, Rashi says he blessed it with the man, it was a double portion, having a double portion, the 6 day of the week, and he sanctified it through the man, through not falling on Shabbos. So God blessed it. So say God blessed the food of Shabbos, and he sanctified it that the food of Shabbos would be there. Verse number 12. Kabed es avicha v'simecha. Honor your father and mother. Laman yericha yemecha. So your days will lengthen. Al adam on the land. Asher Hashem alekecha nasan la, which God has given to you. Now she says, if you honor your parents, your days will be lengthened. But if not, they'll be shortened. But the words of Torah may be explained as being abbreviated. From the positive may infer also the negative. That's one of the ways that Torah is expounded. When the Torah says something positive, we comprehend the negative. When the Torah says something negative, we also can comprehend the positive. And from the negative, we may infer the positive. So the Torah over here doesn't tell you the negative of not honoring your father and mother. But you can understand from the positive the negative. That if you don't honor your father and mother, the Eibishter will do X. Verse number 13. You shouldn't murder. You should not commit adultery. You're not allowed to steal, kidnap, as Rashi is going to say. You're not allowed to fear false witness against your friend. Now she says, you're not allowed to commit adultery. The word niyuf is used only regarding adultery with a married woman. That's adultery. Adultery is a married woman in the Torah. As it says, the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. That's adultery, and that's punishable by the opposite of life. As it says, an adulterous woman takes strange man other than a husband. So that's the concept of an adulteress, a married woman. Rashi says this refers to kidnapping people. Well, the verse "Leisignov," you must not steal, is referring to stealing money. Later on in Vayikra, we have the prohibition of stealing, but in this parsha, "Leisignov" does not mean stealing. It means kidnapping, hostages, or perhaps the verse is referring to stealing money, Rashi says, and later to one to kidnapping. You must say the matter may be deduced from its context. Just as you must not murder and you must not commit adultery, written above, both refer to the matter incurring penalty of death. So we're talking about the concept of the opposite of life. And when you steal, you're not punishable by death. Kidnapping is punishable by death. So therefore, the Torah over here is talking about a death issue, a life and death, capital punishment. And therefore, the Torah is talking about kidnapping. You must not commit adultery, written above, refers to the matter incurring death penalty by sentencing the court. So too, you must not steal, refers to matters incurring death penalty by court, and that is if somebody kidnaps somebody else. Verse number 14. Do not desire your fellow's house. Don't look at somebody else's house and say, I wish I had such a house. Do not desire your fellow's wife. Neither his servant. Neither his maidservant. Don't be jealous of his ox. Of his donkey. Don't be jealous and envious of anything that belongs to somebody else. And that is the 10 Commandments. That's the Chumash for today. We now go to the Tanya of the day. We are holding in chapter 24 of Tanya. The Alter Rebbe is going to prove something over here, that how we cannot evaluate even a sin, cannot say one sin is greater than the other. because a sin is disconnection, as we learn in Chassidus. A sin is a concept of disconnection. A mitzvah is a concept of connection. A sin is a concept of disconnection. And therefore, who knows what is greater than the other? How can we evaluate what's a greater connection and what's a greater disconnection? And therefore, there's an open Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Do not evaluate a mitzvah. Do not evaluate a sin. Everything has its place, and every disconnection, every connection is unbelievable. Now, the Alter Rebbe is going to prove that. That we have a general principle. Pikuach nefesh deiche sharaves. Pikuach nefesh overrides other prohibitions, though not the prohibition of idolatry. Pikuach nefesh doesn't override idolatry. We know we have three cardinal sins: idolatry, adultery, and murder. So besides that, pikuach nefesh doich everything. So it's interesting. Pikuach nefesh doich Shabbos. Pikuach nefesh pushes off the Sabbath. Pikuach nefesh doesn't doich idolatry or adultery. So if a person forces you to rape somebody, God forbid, then you have to give up your life and not do it. But if somebody forces you to break the Shabbos, you should break the Shabbos. And similarly, the Gam Yaver Val Yarig, and similarly sometimes calls upon one to commit a transgression rather than be killed, with idolatry, incest, and murder. The law requires to submit to death rather than commit any one of these three things. So this would seem to indicate that the Torah itself distinguishes between idolatry and most other commandments. Well, the Alter Rebbe previously stated that an adulteress who makes such a distinction has been blinded by the spirit of folly. Why are you blinded? The Torah itself says that there's a difference between idolatry and other mitzvahs. For in reality, every sin tears away from God in the same way as idolatry. So this seems to contradict everything I've said. In the following paragraph, the Alter Rebbe states that there's no contradiction here. The requirement or the non-requirement to sacrifice one's life for a prohibition does not represent its intrinsic worth. It doesn't really show the real concept of this sin. Because this is the way you need to learn it. I knew this, the fact that saving a life overrides other prohibitions. Why are you allowed to break the Shabbos to Pekuach Nefesh? Why are you allowed to break the Shabbos to save a life? Shabbos, the holiest day in the week, it's part of the 10 Commandments. So why are you allowed to break the Shabbos to save somebody's life? So the sages says, Amra Teda, the Teda says, Chilul olav Shabbos achas, break one Shabbos, Kadeshi Yishmer Shabbos, for the sake that he may live to observe other Shabbos. When the medical treatment of a patient involves an activity normally forbidden on Shabbos, the Torah requires that we desecrate the Shabbos to cure him, so that he may observe Shabbos in the future. If you're not going to cure him, and he's going to keep this Shabbos, so you're going to, in essence, keep the Shabbos. That's correct. But now he will never keep another Shabbos because he will die, and he will never keep another Shabbos. So it's the value. Let him keep this. Let him break this Shabbos, A, and now he'll keep Mitzvah in the next 25 years. All these Shabbos. Thus, the precept of Shabbos had been waived in the face of its external consideration. It is the interest of the Shabbos itself, patient's future observance of the Shabbos, that we desecrate this one Shabbos. So that's the point. The point is that we say, in essence, let him break this mitzvah So he'll be able to do it again. Break the Shabbos so he can be able to keep many Shabbosim in the future. If you're not going to do that, then you're basically going to say, oh, you cannot break the Shabbos. Well, now, whether it's yourself or somebody else, somebody's drowning, God forbid, you're allowed to go and do anything you want. You're allowed to go in the boat and go and get the guy. Why? Because he's going to be able to keep the Shabbos in the future. Not because of the relative leniency of Shabbos or the gravity of idolatry, that one is waived while the other is not. To prove it, Alter Rebbe puts it in paragraphs. It's a very interesting concept over here. Alter Rebbe says, Teda, this connection is supported by the following fact. The violation of Shabbos is grave offense, and it's comparable to idolatry in regard to the law of shchita by anyone who habitually violates a particular precept that's codified in Yoreh Deah. So, for example, the Shulchan Aruch states that one who regularly desecrates his Shabbos is unfit for shchita, even though he's a sheichet. Let's say you have a guy that knows all the laws of shchita, he knows all the laws of how to shecht an animal, but he habitually breaks the Shabbos. That person cannot do shchita. That person cannot do shchita. We're not going to have him as a sheichet, even though as a slaughterer, even though animal slaughterer, even though he knows the laws of shchita, and he's actually a phenomenal sheichet. We're not going to do that. The law says if he's a habitual Shabbos breaker, we're not going to accept him. What's interesting is, whether you like it or you're not, that sounds good or not, doesn't sound good, an habitual sex offender, on the other hand, does not have the same law applied to him as an habitual idolater. So, indicating that the violation of Shabbos is greater than a sexual offense. So if a guy is a swinger, if a guy does, even today, because today we don't put a person adulterous to death. So today this law would be, if you have an adulteress, for example, he can be a sheichet in Jewish law. If you have somebody who breaks the Shabbos, he cannot. Now, how does that work? How does that work? You just said something that's a contradiction, because in the Torah, you have the three cardinal sins. One of them is not keeping the Shabbos. So you have the law of adultery, you have the law of idol worship, and you have the law of murder. So I can understand. But actually, so here we say it's one of the three cardinal laws, and then we say, but if a person is an adulteress, can be a sheichet. That doesn't make any sense, because you cannot evaluate a mitzvah and aveda. So even though adulteress is put to death in the Torah law, but it's not because of the gravity of it. It's because of the disconnection. Could you say, what is it? Why would you put something in adulteress to death? I mean, that's, thank God, Baruch Hashem, we don't do that. We don't do that. We put somebody who's an adulteress to death. It's a Torah law. You have to know the Torah law. You have to understand why God said this such a gravity. It's a terrible thing. Let them get divorced. Let them go on their own life. But why would you put the person to death? When a person does other things, or why we say don't do adultery, and if somebody puts a gun to your head, you should lie. But why are you going to keep the Shabbos? They say when somebody puts a gun to your head that you don't die, you should break the Shabbos. So we don't know the true concept of every mitzvah and every aveda. And yet, considering life overrides the Shabbos, but not the sexual prohibition. Thus, it cannot be argued that the requirement to sacrifice oneself for sexual prohibition is due to the gravity. It's not due to its gravity. If we see that the desecration of Sabbath is even graver than the one regarding the shchita, the law of shchita. So for this today, nowadays, when I want to do a wedding, I want witnesses. What is the witnesses that we ask for, that they keep the Shabbos. We don't ask about their sexual behavior. Are they holy in their sexual life? We ask them if they keep the Shabbos. Even though the Torah, the 3 cardinal laws, is the worst, sounding that the worst law is immorality, if they have an immoral lifestyle. We must conclude that the laws governing self-sacrifice are no measure of relative gravity of a mitzvah. You cannot, and that's why I said in the Mishnah says, don't evaluate. You cannot, from the reward and punishment, really evaluate what is the real gravity of something. What is the real negative of something? That the Torah says you should give your life for idolatry, adultery, is because that's what the Torah says. That is what the Torah says. Really, maybe you should give your life for Shabbos and not for adultery. The consideration of life overrides other sins, but not the 3 cardinal sins of idolatry and adultery is a gzeirus hakasav. It's what we call a scriptural decree. It's what God says. So the sinner, however, who does not distinguish between the gravity of various transgressions, sacrificing his life for prohibition of idolatry, but not even restraining his desire for others, surely has his thinking clouded by spiritual folly of klippa, which obscures his hidden love of God. For in reality, every transgression creates the ultimate separation between the sinner and God. And don't be fooled by this. The Alter Rebbe, in essence, showed you, don't be fooled to make evaluations of a sin. Oh, I will never do, like people would say, I would never do idolatry. I would never do adultery. That I would never do. Oh, but other things I will do. Because we all know that these are terrible, terrible things. The Rebbe goes on to say that if a difference is indeed to be drawn between various sins, it's only regard to their effect after they have taken place. And that's what we see in Torah, especially by sins. We see that the Torah says that there's sometimes a death penalty by man, murder. There's sometimes a death penalty by God. And there's Misi b'dei Shamayim, there's death in heaven, there's Kodes, excommunication by God, Kodes to Kodes, if you don't circumcise yourself. B'id Chametz on Pesach, Kodes. So we find these kind of things. The Torah does talk when it comes to sin, not when it comes to a mitzvah. Besides, the only 2 mitzvahs in the Torah that says it's reward. We just read it in the Torah, the 10 Commandments. Honor your father and mother. Do we have a reward? I'll give you a long life. It doesn't say in any other mitzvah that what's the reward? Keep the Shabbos. Why should I keep the Shabbos? What's going to happen if I keep the Shabbos? There's no reward in the Torah for that mitzvah. So there's only two mitzvahs, positive commandments, where the Torah says there's a reward, and that is by the mitzvah of today, keep your honor your father and mother, and Shiluch HaKan later on, where God says to send away the mother bird when you want to take the eggs. The Torah says over there the same thing, that they'll give you a long life. So that's the only 2 mitzvahs that he says a reward. I mean, there is a general statement. We say in Shema, God says, if you follow the commandments, I'll give you the rain. And it's a general concept that God says, I'll give you everything you want. But it doesn't say the reward. We do find by the negative commandments that there is a punishment sometimes. There's there's a punishment by man, 2 different punishments, which is, there are 4 ways of death penalty in the court, and there are lashes in the Torah, 39 lashes, Malchus, it's called Malchus. Learn Masechta Makos, the laws where there is that punishment in the Torah, and there is the punishment of death by God, God forbid, which is the God forbid on, like for example, on Yom Kippur. If you work on Yom Kippur, you eat Yom Kippur, the Eibush says, "I'll cut you off from the Jewish nation. I'll cut you off from life." However, after the sinful act, if the sin is of the type that carries neither the penalty of Kodesh, spiritual extinction of the soul, or misa b'dei shamayim, death in the hands of heaven. That God says, the Gemara says, that means God says the person will die at a young age. In which case a divine soul does not be completely perished, God forbid, and is not entirely cut off from the source from heaven. Except that through the sin that doesn't carry Kodesh, Shemayim, etc. Nevertheless, through the sin, its attachment to its source and its connection with it and being weakened somewhat. In the case of such a sin, the Alter Rebbe concludes after a parenthetical note, the animal soul and the body can rise out of the klippa and unite with the holiness of the divine soul. So in essence, the difference is, on one hand, the sin carrying the penalty of Kodesh or death at the hands of heaven, and other sins explained elsewhere as follows. Connection of the divine soul with its godly source is comparable to a rope woven of 613 strands. Each strand represents one commandment. Every sin severs a corresponding strand. When one strand is broken, the entire rope is weakened, but not severed. The penalty of Kodesh and the death by the hands of heaven, however, cut the rope entirely, so to speak. In the following, we will note the Alter Rebbe states that varying degrees of severity in punishment imposed for various sins correspond to the blemish caused by each sin. The purpose of punishment is not punishment per se. And this is where the Chassidus learns the concept of punishment, but purification of the soul for the blemish that the sin brought about. Thus, the greater the blemish, the more severe punishment. The greater the rectification that is needed. You have to understand, I just want to tell you that when Torah talks about punishment in general, even God's punishment, is when a person was warned and was warned. Most people that have maybe done all these kind of sins is not in that category. It's done b'shoigeg, unintentionally, or unwillingly. Most Jews have been brought up with not Torah mitzvahs. They have no idea that there are these laws. And even if they're told, they don't understand what they're told, what people are telling them. They don't realize the importance of these laws. So therefore, you have to be a saneger and you have to be a defense attorney for the Jewish nation. Corresponding to the extent of the specific nature of the blemish caused by a sin in the soul and its source in the spiritual worlds, are the various purifying processes and punishment of purgatory or in this world. The Gehenna is the suffering of the soul in purgatory, in Gehenna, God forbid, or the one suffering in this world, whose purpose is to purify the soul. For each transgression and sin, its appropriate punishment. Lamarik, and the Eibishter does this out of chesed. God loves this Jew, and he wants to make sure that he purifies himself for the purpose of cleansing and removing the stains and blemish caused by the specific sin. Similar to the blemish caused by sins of carrying penalty of death at the hands of heaven or Kodesh varies from one sin to another. So therefore, everything in Torah is a positive concept, so to say. It's all about self-rectification. To return to the original point, after the sinful act, in the case of those who sin, which do not carry the punishment of Kodesh, of death, at the hands of heaven, the sinner's animal soul, which animates his body and is clothed in it, as well as the body itself. When he does tshuva, return and rise from the klippa, from this covering, from the shell, where they descended when the sin was committed, and they draw closer to the holiness of the divine soul that pervades them. The divine soul always believed in one God. And even at the time of sin, remained never, ever. The godly soul never lost its faith, never lost its commitment. Even as the Jew is doing the sin, the godly soul continues to believe in God and to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. For only the animal soul, while the body is performing this sinful act. At that time, the divine soul is in a state of virtual exile. In the animal soul, which comes from the other side, which causes the body to sin. And it draws down, it pushes down, it brings down the soul, the godly soul, to the lowest depths. Mata, lower and lower. To the impurities. Even to the covering, the klippa, which is called Avodah Zarah. Hashem Yishmerenu, may God help us. So in exile, foreign surrounding restricts him from expressing his abilities and ideas. Similarly, the divine soul, which is in exile within the animal soul, when one sins, is unable to express its mastery over the body. And it's harnessing it for the service of God by reason of foreign environments and of klippa. So that's what that is what we call the Golus Hashchina ultimately. Ve'ein glecha Golus gadol mazeh. And there's no greater exile than this exile. Me'igra Rama, from a very lofty, as the Gemara says, it's the falling down from the Igra Rama, from a very lofty place. My godly soul is schlepped from a very lofty place to a very low place. As I explained earlier, the Sheiru Shumokun Nafshis Kobeis Yisrael. I explained earlier, the root, the source of every Jewish soul. Comes from the wisdom of above. And God and his wisdom is one. And now, how far have we schlepped this soul? That's really the sin. That is really the effect of the sin. Don't worry about the punishment, because the punishment is a reward in essence. If you're worried about the punishment is the rectification. So what do you worry about the punishment? What we should really worry about is what's happening right now. When, God forbid, I'm doing the sin, what's happening right now is I'm taking my soul, which is a chelek elakam imal mamish, which is a part of God, and I'm dragging it down to the lowest of lowest. And I give you an example that when you're doing a sin, when I'm doing a sin, I should imagine I should imagine that I'm standing right next to me is a king, and I'm grabbing the head of the king. And I'm taking the king, I'm dipping his head into a toilet bowl of filth. That's the ultimate concept of humiliation. Even though I'm only doing it for this moment. I'm going to do tshuva next moment. But I cannot control myself. I'm going to humiliate the Eibishter. I'm going to humiliate God. I'm going to take God. I'm going to bring him down to the lowest of lowest for the moment. And that is the sadness of the real situation. Because everything else, the sin and what's the repercussion of the sin, that's all going to work out. That's all going to be rectifiable. Even if I have to go through pain and suffering, it's all the concept of God's kindness. But my act at this moment is what is truly my sadness. It's truly what the negative that I'm doing at this moment, that I'm taking the essence of my soul, the root of my soul, the source of my soul, which is God himself. And I'm drawing down God to the most negative places that I can bring God to. You might say that why I'm using such derogatory words as filth. Why would I use that? Alter Rebbe says, this is not my words. These are the words of the Torah. These are the words of the Talmud. These are the words that are brought down. Because in the Klippos are called vomit and filth, as it is known. So it's not something that I am telling you to give you a shock. You can learn this in the Gemara. You can find this surely in Zohar, which has that expression. Similarly, when one grabs the divine soul, which stems from the divine wisdom of the king's head, so to say, and through his sin forces it into Klippa, in the privy of full of filth, he brings upon his soul the most unspeakable humiliation. Even if he does not, even does only for the moment, for afterwards the soul rises from exile. We thus see the difference between the various sins applies only after the sin. That's all we're worried about. And that's how you're evaluating a sin, is what happens after the sin. Evaluate what's happening by the sin, not after the sin. During the act, however, every sin tears away one from God, since every Jew is endowed with a hidden love of God, by virtue which he wishes to constantly unite with him and never be separate from him, not even for a moment. He can employ this hidden love in fulfilling all mitzvahs and avoiding every sin. As the Alter Rebbe concludes in the following chapter, but here is where the Chitas ends today. Today is the 16th day of the month, which is chapter 79 to chapter 82. You do those 4 chapters, you do the Chitas of the day. The Rebbe says in Ayem Yom, in the name of the previous Lubavitch Rebbe. The previous Lubavitch Rebbe said, my father, the Rebbe Rashab, the 5th Lubavitch Rebbe said, coldness and hearsay are separated by a so slender of a barrier. If a person's cold and a person does hearsay, there's a very thin lane, very thin hair that separates these two concepts. It says, for the eternal your God is a constant fire. Godliness is a flame of fire. If you're cold, then you're on a bridge of being a kafir, so to say, a heretic. Learning Torah and davening must be with a blazing heart, that all my bones may utter the words of God in Torah and the words of God. Be passionate. Show the passion of the heart. Be as a fire. My dear friends, I want to wish you a beautiful Shabbos. I hope everybody goes to shul wherever you are, because on this Shabbos, we read the Aseres Adibris, 10 Commandments, in this week's portion, and everybody should be there. In the Mitch Shem, I'll see you all on. I hope you learn Chitas on yourself on Shabbos, and we'll see you all on Sunday, 8 o'clock. We'll continue to learn the Chitas of the day.